The biting air of early October clung to the port of Rockland, Maine, a coastal town whose heartbeat was as steady and predictable as the tide. This town was a mosaic of weathered clapboard houses, the sharp scent of salt and diesel, and the tireless rhythm of lobster boats heading out before dawn. Amidst the hard-working fishermen, a woman named Elara Vance stood out, not just for her tenacity, but for the quiet shadow that often eclipsed her eyes. She was a figure of lean resilience, her hands callous from years hauling traps, her face a map of sun-etched lines that told stories of countless dawns spent wrestling the Atlantic. At 32, she was an anomaly, a female fisher who owned her own small vessel, the Salty Dog, a boat as old and stubborn as she was, but whose engine was beginning to cough its last. Elara didn't just fish for a living. She fished for a legacy, the phantom weight of a father lost at sea years ago. A loss that had hollowed out her family and left her with a desperate need to control the uncontrollable sea. This particular Tuesday morning, the fog was a thick, damp shroud, muffling the usual clang and chatter of the docks. Elara had just sold her meager catch, 6 undersized lobsters and a handful of good-sized ones, to Old Man Finn, the gruff but fair owner of the local cannery. The meager sum in her pocket barely covered the fuel for the coming week, much less the catastrophic engine repair the Salty Dog desperately needed. She watched as Brendan the King O'Malley, a man whose inherited wealth allowed him a fleet of modern GPS-equipped trawlers, tied up his newest boat, the Sea Serpent 2. Brendan, with his booming laugh and patronizing smile, was the face of the new industrialized Maine fishing industry, and his casual dismissiveness was a constant, subtle jab at Elara's old-school, struggling existence. She felt the familiar hot sting of frustration, a yearning to not just survive, but to truly thrive, to prove that the old ways, the true connection to the sea, still mattered. It was then, amidst the swirling mist and the drone of an unseen foghorn, that she saw the flyer tacked haphazardly to the corkboard outside the harbor master's office. It was a crude, hastily scrawled sign, half peeling from the damp wood. For sale. Boat. $100. As is. The price was a joke. $100 wouldn't even buy a decent anchor chain. It suggested scrap, a hull full of holes, or a vessel cursed beyond repair. Yet the sheer audacity of the price, and the desperation it implied, snagged her attention like a loose hook. She needed an engine, not another burden, but the thought the absurd. Wild thought of a complete change of luck, a hidden gem beneath the rust and decay, was a tiny flicker of hope she couldn't extinguish. She knew the risks of buying $100 boat. It was a gamble against the merciless New England weather, a bet against the crippling debt she already carried, but the alternative was watching the Salty Dog rot at the dock. The pull of this reckless opportunity, this chance to escape the slow, agonizing decline of her current life, was too strong. She tore the flyer from the board, the paper damp and cold beneath her fingers. The smudge of the seller's contact number, an ambiguous promise in the gray morning. The sea had taken much from her, but perhaps, just perhaps, it was ready to give something back, even if it was wrapped in $100 lie. This impulse, this sudden deviation from her meticulously controlled routine, was the first real step away from the shadow of her past and toward a future she couldn't possibly foresee. The old cheap boat wasn't just a potential purchase. It was a symbol of her last desperate throw of the dice against fate. This was the opening move in a game she hadn't known she was playing, a silent contract signed with the unpredictable Atlantic. The small, folded piece of paper in her pocket felt heavier than any lobster she had ever pulled from the depths. Elara's decision was an act of pure, distilled necessity. She knew the boat was likely a derelict, a floating coffin. She'd seen plenty of them, hulls waterlogged, engines seized by rust. vessels abandoned by owners who simply couldn't afford the continuous battle against nature and economics. But her situation was equally dire. The salty dog was going to cost thousands to repair, money she didn't have, money she couldn't possibly borrow. Every morning, the salty dog felt less like a partner and more like a decaying friend. The exhaust smoke was blacker, the rattles more pronounced, the power drop-offs more frequent and terrifying. She had tried everything, patching the hull herself, sourcing used parts from forgotten junkyards, even resorting to the fisherman's desperate prayer to a god she wasn't sure believed in her. But the sea, she knew, was a pragmatist. It respected action, not faith. The flyer's phone number was scribbled in faded black ink, a mirror of the desperation that had caused the owner to sell it for such a paltry sum. That shared sense of struggle, of being at the mercy of forces larger than oneself, created a strange kinship. It felt less like a transaction and more like the passing of a torch, a burden from one broken soul to another. Later that afternoon, after her shift cleaning and mending nets, the salt crusting her eyelashes and the chill seeping into her bones, Elara finally made the call. The voice on the other end was a low, tired rasp belonging to a man named Silas, who sounded as weathered as the boat he was selling. He didn't try to oversell it. She's docked down by the old cannery pier, slip 17. Her name's the Wanderer. Took on some water last winter. I'm too old to deal with her anymore. $100, take it or leave it, miss. Don't waste my time. The sheer indifference in his tone was both a warning and an invitation. No negotiation, no sales pitch, just a final weary dismissal of a once-loved possession. Elara felt a prickle of professional curiosity. What kind of boat was the Wanderer? Was it a forgotten classic, a sturdy hull ruined by neglect, or just a pile of rotten wood waiting for the next high tide to drag it to the seabed? The name, Wanderer, resonated with her own spirit, a feeling of being perpetually adrift, searching for a place, a purpose, a harbor that felt truly like home. She walked the mile down to the old pier as the sun began its slow, bruised descent into the Atlantic, painting the water in hues of cold violet and fading amber. The air grew heavy, thick with the silence that precedes a storm, the kind of stillness that makes every creak and rustle feel significant. Slip 17 was at the very end of the dilapidated dock, a section rarely used except for mooring abandoned vessels. And there she was, the Wanderer. She was a 25-foot vessel, a classic small lobster boat design, but years of neglect had taken a brutal toll. The paint was peeling in large, sun-blistered patches, revealing the gray, thirsty wood beneath. The engine casing was a dull, rusted relic, clearly non-functional. The cabin windows were opaque with grime and salt spray. Yet, as Elara ran a hand over the rough, weathered gunwale, she felt a solidity beneath the decay. The hull, though desperately needing caulking and a fresh coat of antifouling, seemed fundamentally sound. The lines were good, the structure honest. It had been built for the sea, not for show. It was a project, a massive, back-breaking project, but it had potential. It was a raw, defiant piece of history waiting to be resurrected. A brief, almost silent exchange took place. Silas, a stooped man with a fisherman's slow gait and eyes that had seen too much weather, met her at the dock. He handed her the faded registration papers, the transfer of ownership a mere formality, a $100 bill changing hands like a handshake over a grave. The engine's done, Miss Vance. You'll need to haul her out just to see what you're dealing with. Good luck. He didn't look sad, just relieved. As he shuffled away, his silhouette swallowed by the growing twilight, Elara was left alone with her new purchase. The Wanderer, a vessel that was, in all brutal honesty, a $100 monument to misplaced optimism. She climbed aboard, the deck groaning under her weight. the air in the cabin stale and heavy with the smell of old fish, mildew, and something else, something indefinable, a faint metallic scent like forgotten secrets. A profound and irrational sense of ownership settled over her. This wasn't just a boat. It was her final chance, a clean slate, and a physical manifestation of her own battered yet unyielding spirit. The salty dog was her past. The wanderer, for all its flaws, was the fragile, waterlogged promise of a future. She began to clean, driven by a sudden, frantic energy. It was during this initial, determined scour of the cramped, moldy cabin, moving a stack of old water-damaged navigation charts from a recessed compartment near the helm, that her fingers brushed against something hard, a slight, almost imperceptible protrusion. She paused, the smell of Lysol and mildew suddenly sharper in the close air. Behind the charts, tucked into a sliver of space that looked like a long-forgotten repair job, was a tightly rolled canvas scroll, no bigger than a man's thumb, secured with a thin, brittle piece of twine. The twine snapped easily in her hands, and as she unrolled the stiff, aged material, the faint, flickering light from the pier cast an eerie glow on the dark, complex lines drawn across the canvas. It wasn't just a chart. It was a map, and its secrets were only just beginning to unfold. The adrenaline hit her fast and hard, chasing away the bone-deep cold, replacing her fatigue with a searing jolt of pure, unadulterated curiosity. The $100 gamble had just paid its first astonishing dividend. The aged, cryptic map Elara held was more than just lines on canvas. It was an echo, a tangible connection to the same turbulent history that had shaped the very contours of her life. Unrolling the scroll fully under the dim, flickering lamp of the wanderer's cabin revealed not the standard navigational grids of modern charts, but rough, hand-drawn coordinates and landmarks sketched in faded sepia Inca, style reminiscent of maps from the early to mid-20th century. One dominant feature was a large, crudely drawn X near a stretch of coastline known locally as the Whispering Coves, an area notorious for hidden reefs and treacherous currents, mostly abandoned by modern commercial fishers due to its inherent danger. But the map, for all its mystery, momentarily faded into the background as Elara, still reeling from the shock of her discovery, felt the familiar heavy weight of her past descend upon her. The sea that had just presented her with a puzzle was also the relentless entity that had to find her. Existence in Rockland, Elara's life had been etched into the harsh, beautiful landscape of coastal Maine. She wasn't born into wealth or privilege. Her lineage was purely working class, a proud, stoic line of fishermen who had weathered economic depressions, severe storms, and the gradual, grinding shift from small-scale independence to corporate dominance. Her father, Thomas Vance, was the heart of this legacy. He was a man whose laughter was as deep as the ocean and whose knowledge of the tides was almost spiritual. He taught Elara everything: how to read the clouds for a coming squall, how to mend a net until the repair was invisible, and the unspoken fundamental rule of the sea respected, for it will take what you love most without hesitation. And the sea, true to its nature, had taken Thomas 5 years ago. His 20-foot dory, the original Salty Dog, was found capsized near the Monhegan Island, but his body was never recovered. The official report cited unforeseen weather, a bureaucratic dismissal that did nothing to soothe the agonizing open wound of Elara and her mother, Martha. The loss was catastrophic, both emotionally and financially. Martha, a former school teacher whose health had declined sharply after Thomas's disappearance, was left with crushing debt and the burden of maintaining their small waterfront cottage a mortgage Thomas had always promised to pay off with the next big haul. Elara, barely 27 then, abandoned her faint plans for college and an escape inland. strapping on her oilskins and taking over the remnants of her father's meager business. She renamed her first small boat in his honor, a defiant gesture against the fate that had swallowed him. Her days became a grueling cycle of early mornings, cold decks, and endless financial anxiety, each trip out a battle against the elements and the crushing weight of interest payments. She didn't just mourn Thomas, she fought to keep his memory and his way of life from being completely erased by the economic tides that favored Brendan O'Malley and his Ulk, Brendan the King. O'Malley represented everything Elara instinctively resented. His family money, made initially in shipbuilding, now dominated the local fishing industry through massive, efficient operations. Brendan, with his expensive gear and careless confidence, often bought up the best fishing grounds, squeezing out the smaller, independent fishers like Elara. His interactions with her were always tainted by a condescending pity, a subtle implication that she was playing a dangerous, losing game and should simply sell her license and find something easier. The conflict with Brendan was more than just professional rivalry. It was a fundamental clash of values, his sleek, corporate efficiency versus her rugged, inherited tradition. Every successful trip Elara made was a silent victory against his dominance, a declaration that the old ways still had grit. The wanderer now sat in stark contrast to her current life. It was a tangible $100 interruption to a predictable, painful routine. As Elara sat on the edge of the vessel's bunk, tracing the fragile lines of the map, she realized this discovery was stirring an emotion she hadn't felt in years. Curiosity divorced from survival. Normally, every thought was geared toward the next haul, the next payment, the next storm. But this map was a mystery for mystery's sake, an adventure that required a commitment not of endurance, but of intellect and courage. The faint metallic smell in the cabin, she now identified, was aged brass polish. And as she looked closer, she noticed faint circular indentations on a small wooden panel near the chart table, suggesting a compass or a clock was once permanently mounted there. These small, forgotten details hinted at the previous owner, Silas, not as a weary seller, but as someone who had perhaps protected this secret for decades. Someone who had lived a life defined by something other than catching lobster. Her mother, Martha, sensed the shift in Elara immediately. That evening, back in their small, salt-laced cottage, the air thick with the smell of simmering clam chowder, Martha watched her daughter with concern. Elara was quieter than usual, her focus distant, a slight, almost manic energy buzzing beneath her fatigue. Martha didn't need to ask. She knew the sea had offered Elara something, either a great hope or a crushing new burden. "What did you buy, Elara?" Martha asked, her voice soft but steady. "A boat that's more ghost than wood, I imagine." Elara hesitated, the map safely tucked inside a waterproof bag. She couldn't tell her mother yet, not until she understood what she held. The possibility of this being a meaningless distraction was high, and Martha, whose heart was already fragile, didn't need another false dawn. "A project, Ma. A very cheap, very big project. Might have a good hull under the rust. I need a change." Martha simply nodded, the knowing sadness of a mother who understood her daughter's restless soul reflected in her eyes. "Just be careful, my girl. The sea gives nothing for free." Elara carried that warning with her as she returned to the Wanderer the next morning. Her decision to pursue the map's secret wasn't reckless abandon. It was a deeply personal, almost rebellious act of hope. If the map led to nothing, she would have wasted a few hours. If it led to something, anything, it could represent the financial freedom to escape the crushing anxiety that suffocated her and, more importantly, the chance to secure a future for her mother. The location indicated by the X wasn't just a place. It was a radical break from her routine, a foray into the unknown, driven by the belief that life, which had taken so much, owed her one incredible, impossible chance. The map was calling not just to a destination, but to the hidden core of her own courage, daring her to be more than just the struggling daughter of a lost fisherman. She traced the rough coordinates, her thumb rubbing against the aged canvas, deciding not just to plot a course, but to change the trajectory of her life. The Wanderer, the old boat purchased on impulse, was now her unlikely vessel of destiny. The historical context of the map itself deepened the intrigue. The time period it appeared to be from coincided with the Prohibition era, a time when Maine's rugged, isolated coastline was a perfect haven for rum runners and secretive operations. The Whispering Coves were known in local lore as a place where hidden caches and temporary shelters were common for those avoiding federal scrutiny. Could the X mark a cache of illicit goods, forgotten and now potentially priceless? The thought was scandalous, terrifying, and thrilling all at once. It added a layer of complexity to the mystery, elevating it beyond a simple treasure hunt to a dive into the darker, forgotten history of her own coastline. Elara felt a pulse of genuine excitement, a sensation she hadn't associated with the fishing life since she was a child, before the sea had become a cruel, demanding master. This map, this centennial secret, offered a chance to rewrite her story, turning her from a survivor into a seeker. Her eyes, usually heavy with exhaustion, were alight with a fierce, focused determination. The $100 boat was, indeed, proving to be the most expensive purchase of her life, not in currency, but in the sheer potential of the unknown. The purchase of the Wanderer had been a fleeting, desperate exchange in the twilight, but the real transaction, the deep, binding commitment, began the moment Elara decided to prioritize the map over her immediate survival. The $100 haul was now tied firmly alongside the struggling, salty dog, a physical symbol of the internal tug-of-war between practicality and possibility. Before she could even dream of following the cryptic lines of the map, she had to make the Wanderer seaworthy, at least minimally, enough to reach the perilous, whispering coves marked by the X. This necessary labor became the crucible of the third day, a period of intensive cleaning and inspection that yielded more than just clear bilge water. The first step was hauling the Wanderer out. She secured a cheap, late-night slot at the shipyard, avoiding the daylight scrutiny of the other fishers and especially the watchful, cynical eyes of Brendan O'Malley, who would undoubtedly mock her new $100 folly. Using every ounce of her strained savings and leveraging a meager favor from a weary yard manager, Elara managed to get the boat lifted onto blocks. What she saw underneath was a testament to Silas's exhaustion. The hull was indeed structurally sound, the heavy oak ribs still holding fast, a craft built in an era when durability superseded speed. However, the outer planks were riddled with small, stress-induced cracks, and the keel required serious attention. It was a miracle the boat hadn't taken on more water. More importantly, the entire underbelly was covered in layers of thick, encrusted barnacles and algae, a natural camouflage that spoke volumes about how long the boat had been left untended. As Elara scraped the decades of sea growth from the Wanderer's port side, working under the harsh glare of a single utility lamp, she noticed something unusual, a pattern break in the barnacle growth near the stern. It wasn't just a patch of clean wood. It was an area that suggested recent activity, perhaps a hurried repair or modification. She chipped away the remaining calcified layers with focused intensity, revealing a small, expertly placed patch of wood, slightly lighter in color than the aged planks around it. This patch wasn't a repair for damage. It was a deliberate concealment. Beneath the patch, secured with brass screws meticulously filed down to sit flush with the hull, was a small, hinged compartment, a cubby or a small safe, designed to be practically invisible from the outside. Her heart pounded against her ribs, with a rhythm as frantic as the scraping tool in her hand. This was no simple forgotten boat. It was a vessel with secrets intentionally built into its frame. Prying the small door open required effort. The hinges rusted almost shut. When it finally groaned open, revealing a dry, felt-lined interior, Elara found two items. The first was a small, well-maintained brass pocket compass, its needle still swinging true, its face engraved with the initials ST. The second was a heavy, leather-bound journal, its pages brittle but protected from the moisture. This journal was the unexpected, irreplaceable key to the map dot back in the quiet sanctity of the wanderer's cabin. Elara carefully opened the journal. The handwriting was elegant, precise, and immediately recognizable as belonging to someone older than Silas, or perhaps Silas's ancestor, judging by the dated entries. The first entry was from 1928, the author, who signed his final entries with the same initials. ST detailed the construction of a series of small, coastal shacks and storage caches used during the height of the Prohibition era. Operations designed to shelter illegal liquor shipments from the Canadian Maritimes. The journal wasn't a criminal log. It was a philosophical and practical record of a man who saw himself as an essential part of an underground economy, a freeman defying government overreach. He detailed the extreme precautions taken to hide their operations, not just from the law, but from rival gangs. The pages confirmed Elara's intuition about the map. The X marked the location of the primary shelter, described in detail as an unassuming structure nestled deep in the coves, built into the bedrock, proof against all but a direct hurricane. The journal's author, ST, revealed a critical piece of information. The shelter was designed to hold not just a few crates of whiskey, but a massive emergency cache of final. Large shipments stored away just before the Volstead Act was repealed in 1933. A shipment intended to be sold off slowly during the expected post-repeal demand boom. But the journal abruptly stopped in 1934, mid-sentence, the ink trailing off into a smudge of finality. The last entry spoke of a sudden, urgent trip to the shelter, a problem with the inventory. They suspect us. Must secure the final load. Taking the wanderer alone. The King of the North will find nothing but empty sea. The reference to the King of the North was chilling, suggesting a dangerous rival or a federal agent, a clear parallel to her current nemesis, O'Malley, the modern king of the port. The lack of any subsequent entry created a vacuum of 70 years of forgotten history. What happened to ST? Was he caught? Or did he simply disappear, leaving behind a fortune in pre-Depression era whiskey and perhaps more? The gravity of the situation hit Elara with the force of a rogue wave. This wasn't just old fishing gear. This was a potential fortune, wrapped in a forgotten tragedy, hidden just miles up the coast. The conflict became internal. Not just, should I go, but can I handle this? The financial freedom this cash represented was intoxicating. A solution to all her problems, a way to save her mother and herself from the tyranny of debt. But the risks were monumental. The location was dangerous, the currents alone enough to sink the wanderer, and if the rival, the King of the North, or his descendants, still existed and remembered the legend, she could be walking into a century-old trap. The next day, Elara worked with a renewed, desperate focus. She bypassed the engine entirely. There was no time or money for a full repair. Instead, she concentrated on the mast and sails, which, though tattered, were remarkably intact. The Wanderer, she realized, was originally built with a powerful auxiliary sail plan, a common feature in rum-running boats that needed to be silent and fast if the engine failed or needed to be cut for stealth. She spent a grueling 12 hours caulking the hull leaks with marine sealant, replacing crucial ropes, and cleaning the sails until they were pliable. She cannibalized a working radio and a minimal GPS unit from the Salty Dog, an act that felt like signing her old boat's death warrant, but a necessary sacrifice. As she worked, Elara realized that the story in the journal mirrored her own struggle, a small operator fighting against the kings of their day, seeking to carve out a living on the fringes. This connection deepened her resolve. The map and the journal were not just a treasure hunt. They were a legacy, a final message from a fellow independent spirit who had fought and perhaps failed. She felt a profound obligation to finish his journey, to expose the secret he died protecting, and, in doing so, secure her own future. That evening, as the moon cast long, skeletal shadows over the docks, Elara made the final preparations. She packed emergency rations, a heavy-duty flashlight, a hammer, and a crowbar. Before leaving, she pressed a kiss to her mother's forehead. Martha was asleep, medicated against the constant pain. Elara left a short, vague note, gone north to test the new sails. Be back soon. It was a lie of necessity. Standing on the deck of the Wanderer just before midnight, the old boat felt lighter, almost eager. The tide was high, the perfect time for a silent, unseen departure. She didn't dare start the engine. Instead, she raised the auxiliary sails, the canvas catching the faint, cool northern breeze with a soft snap. With a final, decisive push against the pier, Elara cast off the lines. The Wanderer slid silently into the black, open water, a ghost ship carrying a modern-day seeker on a mission dictated by a Prohibition-era map. The $100 vessel was now priceless, a vessel of destiny sailing straight into the eye of a 70-year-old storm. The Wanderer ghosted out of Rockland Harbor, propelled by a silent conspiracy between the wind and Elara's desperate will. The engine remained cold, a dead weight in the hull, forcing her to rely on the ancient, patched sails and her own prodigious skill as a mariner. This silent propulsion was an advantage. It meant her departure was unnoticed by the few straggling night watchmen and, crucially, by Brendan O'Malley, who kept an office near the fuel docks. The sea was a black, moonless canvas, the only illumination coming from the scattered, cold light of distant shore beacons. Now, with the hum of the town receding, Elara could finally dedicate herself to the most crucial, immediate task, translating the cryptic map in conjunction with ST's journal dot. She laid the brittle canvas map flat on the chart table, securing the corners with heavy fishing weights. The journal, now open to its final, chilling entries, lay beside it. The map used a mixture of old-world nautical terminology and localized, almost poetic landmarks terms that would be meaningless to anyone unfamiliar with the obscure geography of the Maine coast before modern dredging and construction. Elara, however, recognized the dialect of the true coastal inhabitants, the language of the rocks and the tides. The crucial area was the Whispering Coves. ST's entries detailed why the location was ideal for the shelter. It is the convergence of the Iron Current and the Shadow Stream, he wrote in 1930, a point where the two strong flows meet, creating a perpetual, shifting turmoil that makes navigation treacherous, save for a 20-minute window at the turn of the slack tide. This explained the cove's abandonment. Only a madman or a desperate smuggler would risk navigating that area, let alone build a permanent structure there. The X on the map, Elara now understood, was not a simple pin drop. It corresponded to 3 intersecting, hand-drawn lines. The first line was an azimuth based on the alignment of 2 specific, oddly shaped sea stacks, which ST called the Twins of Patience. The second was a depth measurement, marked simply as 35 fathoms, no more. But the third line was the most perplexing, a series of dots and dashes next to the X, written in the same faded ink. It looked like Morse code, but its pattern was irregular. Consulting the journal again, Elara found a corresponding, almost hidden entry from 1932 detailing a secondary environmental security measure, a complex sequence of low-frequency sonar pulses designed to navigate the permanent underwater minefield of jagged reefs that protected the entry to the inner cove. The dots and dashes weren't Morse code. They were a rhythm of sound, a specific sequence of slow, then quick sounds, the boat's horn maybe, that St would use to orient himself based on the echoes from the cove's treacherous, echoing rock faces. This level of ingenious, almost paranoid complexity sent a shiver down Elara's spine. Say hadn't just hidden a cache. He had engineered an entire silent defense system against anyone who would try to find it. This wasn't just about rum. This was about a massive, high-stakes operation involving people who were ruthless enough to disappear a competitor without a trace, people who might have descendants just as ruthless. The King of the North, from ST's final entry, now felt less like history and more like a potential present threat. The journey itself was grueling. Without the engine, the Wanderer was at the mercy of the autumn winds. Elara calculated the distance, roughly 30 miles of hard sailing against a persistent crosswind. She was alone, the familiar ache of fatigue already settling in her shoulders, but the adrenaline fueled her. Every creak of the hull, every sudden shift in the wind, was amplified in the deep darkness. Her connection to the Wanderer deepened through this shared adversity. She learned the boat's subtle personality, the slight list to starboard, the way the mainmast groaned just before a squall, the distinct, almost musical slap of the waves against the hull that was different from the salty dog. This $100 mistake was proving to be a surprisingly capable, if exhausted, partner. As dawn broke, a bruised line of red and purple on the eastern horizon, Elara had navigated halfway, bypassing the main shipping lanes and keeping tight to the shore to avoid being spotted by the large trawlers, particularly any bearing the O'Malley colors. She found a temporary, secluded anchorage behind a small, uninhabited island to rest and check her bearings. She spent the few hours of rest not sleeping, but reinforcing her plan. She realized the narrow window of slack tide St mentioned was her only opportunity. She would have to time her entry into the Whispering Coves precisely at 3:17 p.m. that afternoon, the moment the iron current and the shadow stream momentarily neutralized each other. Miss that window, and the Wanderer, without a functioning engine to power against the flow, would be smashed against the reefs. The final leg of the journey began with the sun high overhead, casting a blinding, deceptive light on the water. Elara's anxiety mounted as the coastline ahead grew ragged, transforming from gentle, sloping hills to sheer, dark cliffs peppered with the ominous shapes of jagged rocks. She passed the 2 sea stacks, the twins of patience, and aligned the Wanderer exactly as the map dictated. The sea immediately changed its mood. The gentle swell turned into a confused, violent chop. The Wanderer bucked and groaned, and the sails struggled against the contradictory forces of the colliding currents. Elara gripped the helm, her knuckles white, her focus absolute. The time was 3:10 p.m. She checked the compass, brass compass, its needle wavering erratically in the magnetic field created by the rocks. She needed to find the exact point where the depth meter, cannibalized from the salty dog, would read 35 fathoms. The depth plunged from 50 to 20, then 38 too deep before stabilizing, precisely at 3:17 p.m. at 35 fathoms. Now, she whispered, adrenaline burning away her fatigue. She grabbed the boat's antique horn, a foghorn powered by a small hand pump, and began the sequence, 2 long, mournful blasts, a pause, 3 rapid, sharp blasts, a pause, 1 long blast. The sounds echoed violently off the massive, dark cliff faces, the noise bouncing back in a chaotic, confusing manner. But she listened intently, not for the sound, but for the pattern of the echoes. Finally, a faint, Delayed echo returned from a specific point, a point where the cliff face seemed slightly recessed, partially hidden by a curtain of sea spray and hanging moss. It was the only place the sound returned with such a distinct delay. This was the entrance. A barely perceptible gap in the towering rock, a passage so narrow and treacherous that it was perfectly camouflaged. The slack-tide held, a 20-minute gift from the ocean. Elara, with a silent prayer to her father in St, hauled hard on the tiller. The wanderer, responding to her command, sliced sideways into the narrow, churning entrance, the hull passing within inches of the razor-sharp rocks. The sea spray instantly engulfed the small boat, and the noise of the rushing water was deafening. After what felt like an eternity, the current released its hold, and the boat glided into a pocket of absolute, eerie stillness. She was inside the Whispering Coves, a natural, hidden harbor, utterly silent, forgotten, and protected by a century of geological and human design. Directly ahead, nestled into the base of the massive cliff, almost indistinguishable from the rock face, was the objective, a small, solitary, weathered structure, the abandoned harbor shack. The hidden cove was a world apart. Once through the narrow, churning bottleneck, the water smoothed into a sheet of dark glass, reflecting the towering, moss-covered cliffs in perfect stillness. The air here was heavy with the smell of damp earth and deep shade, devoid of the bracing, open ocean scent. Elara dropped the wanderer's anchor, the chain rattling softly, the only sound in this silent sanctuary. The time was 3:45 p.m. She had approximately 6 hours of daylight left, and she knew she couldn't linger. She needed to find what was hidden, secure anything of value, and make her escape before the evening high tide made the passage even more unpredictable. The shelter, nestled at the base of the tallest cliff face, was remarkably preserved, a tribute to St's craftsmanship. It was built of heavy, rough-cut stone and logs, blending almost perfectly with the surrounding rock and brush. It looked less like a shack and more like a permanent bunker, designed to withstand the harsh realities of a Maine winter and the prying eyes of the law. The entrance was a single, low-slung wooden door, its heavy hinges visibly rusted, secured by a massive, old-fashioned iron padlock that looked as if it hadn't been touched in decades. Elara secured the wanderer to an outcropping of rock and climbed ashore, her boots crunching on the wet black pebbles. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the faint, distant roar of the ocean currents battling outside the cove's entrance. She approached the door cautiously. The iron padlock was too robust for her to simply break. She pulled the heavy crowbar from her bag, the tool of last resort. It took several minutes of strained, focused effort, the metal groaning a tortured protest that echoed eerily in the enclosed space. Finally, with a sharp, wrenching crack, the shackle tore free, and the heavy door fell inward with a hollow boom, releasing a blast of stale, earthy, intensely cold air. Elara paused on the threshold, illuminating the interior with her powerful flashlight. The beam cut through the thick, dust-laden darkness, revealing a space far larger than the exterior suggested. It was indeed a bunker, built into the side of the mountain, dry and remarkably intact. The air was cold, but not damp, a perfect cellar. Racks lined the walls, and the floor was tightly packed earth. And there, filling the space from floor to ceiling, were wooden crates, hundreds of them, stacked with the meticulous organizations T's journal had hinted at. The labels, though faded, were still legible. Scotch whiskey, Glen MHOR minus 1,925, and French Cognac Premier CRU Rare Reserve. The realization was a punch to the gut, a dizzying blend of disbelief and elation. This wasn't just a cache of forgotten rum. This was a massive, incredibly valuable haul of high-end, pre-Prohibition spirits, aged in perfect cellar conditions for nearly a century. The true magnitude of the discovery hit her. This wasn't just a way out of debt. It was the foundation for a new life, the end of her relentless struggle. Driven by a surge of frantic energy, Elara moved deeper into the bunker, checking the integrity of the crates. They were heavy, confirming they were full. In the center of the room, however, was a space that had been purposefully left clear. And in that space lay another discovery, one that instantly chilled her elation. Lying on the packed earth, partially covered by a thin layer of fine dust, was a human skeleton. It was positioned awkwardly, one arm outstretched, as if reaching for the exit. Near the skeletal hand lay a rusted, antique single-action revolver and a small leather pouch. Elara's breath hitched in her throat. The cold silence of the bunker suddenly felt oppressive, heavy with the weight of this forgotten death. She realized with chilling certainty that this was ST, the man who wrote the journal. The man who designed the complex defenses had made it to his final resting place, but not out of it. She approached the remains with a mixture of reverence and fear. The flashlight beam trembling slightly, the leather pouch contained two things: a silver locket, tarnished but still beautiful, engraved with the words, "To Martha, always," and a thin, rolled-up sheet of paper, clearly the final, frantic entry that had been missing from the journal. Elara's mind raced. Martha, her mother's name. A common name, perhaps, but the coincidence was too jarring. She gently picked up the paper, unfolding the brittle sheet. The handwriting was ST's, shaky now, desperate. They followed me. The king, he tracked the wanderer. I shot him, but he hit me first low, near the lung. I sealed the entrance. He is trapped outside. He said he knows Martha. He said he would go to her, take her, find the coordinates, protect the king's cargo. My body is fading, but the treasure is safe. Tell Martha I love her, always. Sti. The revelation was a series of seismic shocks. The remains of the rival, the king of the north, must be trapped outside. He hadn't just died. He had been sealed into the cove, possibly the entrance Elara herself had so barely squeezed through. More importantly, the locket and the name Martha were an undeniable link to her own family. Her mother, Martha Vance, had always been quiet, almost guarded about her past before meeting Elara's father, Thomas. The locket was addressed to her. Was ST, the rum runner, her biological grandfather? The dates aligned. ST disappeared in 1934, and her mother was born in the late 1930s. The emotion that flooded Elara was profound and terrifying. A sudden, powerful connection to a ghost, a dramatic rewrite of her entire family history, intertwined with a massive illegal fortune. The man who died here was not a stranger, but a secret protector, a grandfather she never knew. Elara knew she had to move quickly. The king's body was likely long gone, but the legacy of the feud was real. The journal entry mentioned a king's cargo, a hint of a second cache, a counter-treasure perhaps. She needed to secure proof of the discovery and the link to ST before escaping. She carefully took the journal, the map, the locket, and the final note. As a sign of respect and closure, she draped ST's jacket over his remains. She then focused on the fortune. She couldn't take the hundreds of crates, but she could take enough to change her life forever. Using the crowbar, she pried open a few of the sturdiest crates near the entrance, finding the bottles perfectly sealed, the amber liquid inside gleaming in her flashlight beam. She carefully selected 20 of the most valuable-looking bottles, the 1925 Scotch and the rare reserve Cognac, and wrapped them in canvas from the old sails, placing them securely in her boat. This was more than enough. One bottle of this quality, aged under these circumstances, could be worth tens of thousands. Exhausted but galvanized by the rush of history and urgency, Elara prepared to leave. She secured the door as best she could with heavy rocks, leaving the mystery of ST and his treasures safe for now. As she motored, using a small, portable electric bilge pump to silently push the boat, a backup plan out of the eerie silence of the cove. Passing back into the tumultuous, echoing narrow passage, she felt less like a struggling fisherwoman and more like the guardian of a powerful, dangerous secret. The truth about ST and the locket had transformed the treasure hunt into a profound, personal quest for identity and reconciliation. Elara's return voyage was a blur of exhaustion and heightened awareness. She sailed through the night, the 20 bottles of Prohibition-era spirits wrapped like fragile newborns, the locket and ST's journal tucked securely beneath her mattress. The journey back was physically less strenuous. The wind was now at her back, but the emotional burden of the discovery was immense. She had left as Elara Vance, struggling fisher, and returned as the custodian of a vast secret and a devastating family history. She slipped into Rockland Harbor just before the pre-dawn rush, anchoring the Wanderer back at the dilapidated Slip 17. The first thing she did was lock the journal, the map, and the bottles in a heavy-duty, rust-proof lockbox she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her cottage, a measure of precaution that felt necessary now that she was playing for stakes far beyond lobster. Money-the sun was barely above the horizon when Elara sat down at the kitchen table, waiting for her mother, Martha, to wake. The small, familiar cottage, usually a place of quiet comfort, now felt charged with the electricity of the secret. When Martha finally shuffled into the room, her movements slow with age and pain, Elara saw her with new eyes, searching for the lines and shadows that might betray a long-kept secret. Elara didn't hesitate. She placed the tarnished silver locket and the final brittle note from ST on the table between them. "Ma," Elara said, her voice steady but thick with emotion, "I need you to tell me about tea." Martha froze, her hand halfway to the kettle. Her eyes, usually veiled by a gentle sadness, widened in a flash of pure, undisguised terror and recognition. She stared at the locket, the familiar engraving, to Martha, always, and her face crumbled, the fragile composure of decades instantly dissolving. Tears Elara hadn't seen in years tracked clean paths down her mother's face. Where did you get this?" Martha whispered, her voice barely audible, the raw, ancient pain in the sound cutting Elara to the core. Elara recounted the story, carefully omitting the gruesome detail of the skeleton, focusing instead on the Wanderer, the map, the shelter, and the journal. She told her mother about ST, the rum runner, the man who had loved Martha enough to leave his life's fortune for her. Martha finally sank into a chair, clutching the locket, her hands trembling. The revelation poured out of her, decades of silence finally broken. "He was my father, Elara, Silas Thomas. I was his secret. He was already married, a difficult man, but he loved me and my mother fiercely. He used to slip away on the Wanderer, disappearing for days. Everyone knew he was running liquor, but nobody dared cross him. The locket, he gave it to me just before he left on that final trip. He promised he would return, that he would make enough money from the final score to take us away, to give us a real, honest life." Martha paused, wiping a tear. When he never came back, his other family, his half-brother, silenced everything. They forced my mother to move, to change her name. The town covered it up. It was the Prohibition. Money spoke louder than truth. I met your father, Thomas, years later. He was the only good man who ever saw past my quiet sadness. He never knew the truth about ST I couldn't bear to tell him. The emotional impact was staggering. Elara hadn't just found a treasure. She had found the root of her mother's lifelong melancholy, the true reason for her guarded nature. ST's final, frantic note about the king, and the threat to Martha now made agonizing sense. The man who had been trapped outside the shelter, the king of the north, was the rival Sid had feared, possibly a competitor or a federal agent who knew Martha's existence and meant to use her to find the cash. But the emotional breakthrough was violently interrupted just as the sun crested the rooftops, washing the harbor in cold, brilliant light. A deafening noise shattered the calm. It was the sound of a large vessel, aggressively accelerating, followed by the blare of a powerful air horn. Elara rushed to the window, her blood turning to ice. The sleek, massive hull of the Sea Serpent II, Brendan, O'Malley's newest trawler, was pulling alongside the dilapidated Slip 17. Brendan stood on the deck, his face a mask of cold fury, flanked by two burly deckhands. "Vance!" Brendan's voice boomed, amplified by a megaphone, carrying across the still harbor. "I know where you've been. I've known about the Wanderer and the old man's junk for weeks." Elara's mind raced. How could he know? She had been so careful. Then she remembered Silas, the weary old seller. The initials as Silas Thomas. The seller, the descendant, must have been Silas, T's grandson, the man too tired to fight. He must have recognized Elara's desperation and decided to sell the boat and the secret as a final act of spite. Or perhaps a warning, knowing Brendan had been tracking the Wanderer's legacy. "You took Silas Thomas's boat. My family has been tracking the rum runner's legend for generations. We knew that $100 heap was the key," Brendan shouted, his voice laced with venomous triumph. "The king of the north he wrote about? He was my grandfather's brother. He died trying to stop that lowlife rum runner, ST. That treasure belongs to my family, Vance. It's the king's cargo." Brendan's trawler was positioned perfectly, ready to ram the small Wanderer and search it. He had followed the legend of the king and ST, and recognized the pattern of Elara's sudden, unscheduled trip north. The confrontation was the culmination of their rivalry. A clash not just over fishing grounds, but over the buried history of their respective families. Elara realized the weight of ST's final note. "The king of the north will find nothing but empty sea, ... The feud was never over liquor. It was over ownership and legacy. Elara looked at her mother, who was now weeping silently, clutching the locket. Elara's fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, fierce rage. She was not just fighting for money now. She was fighting to protect her mother's peace and her grandfather's memory from the king's inheritor. "You won't find anything on the Wanderer?" "O'Malley," Elara yelled back, stepping out of the cottage and onto the small dock, projecting confidence she didn't entirely feel. "I didn't steal a thing. I bought the boat legally, and whatever I found is mine." Brendan laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "We'll see about that, Vance. We know the location is on the north coast. Either you give me the coordinates, or you lose your license, your cottage, and your worthless boat." He gestured to one of his deckhands, who was carrying a heavy chain dot. This was the ultimate test. Elara knew the immediate threat was the 20 bottles in the lockbox and ST's documents. She had to end this now, decisively, and not with force, but with the one thing she possessed that Brendan could never match: the truth. Elara stood firm on the dilapidated dock, facing the towering wrath of Brendan O'Malley. The wind, which had carried her silently back to safety, now whipped around them, a furious witness to the conflict. Brendan, confident in his superior power and equipment, ordered his deckhands to ready the chain to haul the Wanderer onto his deck for inspection. "You can play tough, Vance," Brendan sneered, watching his men approach the smaller boat. "But your old tub is about to be seized for inspection of unsafe mooring and undocumented cargo. I'll have that boat stripped, and you won't be able to afford the fine." Elara's voice cut through the air. sharp and clear, devoid of the emotional tremble he expected. "You are not seizing anything, O'Malley." And I found no undocumented cargo. What I found was a truth that your family tried to bury for 70 years. A truth that explains why you are just as pathetic and obsessed as your King of the North grandfather. Brendan recoiled, his face blanching slightly. The use of King of the North and grandfather struck a nerve names usually only whispered in the most private, vindictive family circles. "My grandfather died trying to enforce the law," Brendan roared, trying to regain control. "No," Elara countered, pulling the brittle final note of ST from her pocket, holding it aloft. "He died trying to steal a fortune. Your ancestor wasn't a lawman. He was a rival rum runner who followed my grandfather, Silas Thomas, to the shelter, sealed him out, and your grandfather probably starved or succumbed to the elements trying to get in. Your whole family legacy is based on a lie and a failure." This public accusation, delivered with such unwavering certainty, momentarily stunned the deckhands and silenced the few early morning onlookers. Elara continued, pressing her advantage. "I know where the shelter is, O'Malley. I know the coordinates, the tides, and the secret sonar sequence. And I know there are hundreds of crates of whiskey and cognac down there. A fortune. And you will never find it because you don't know the secrets of the sea. You only know the price of fuel." She took a breath, delivering the final, decisive blow. "But you know what else I found? The remains of my grandfather, Silas Thomas, and an artifact that proves his legacy is legitimate, not criminal. If you touch my boat, I will go to the district attorney, show them my grandfather's notes and the locket. I will tell them I found my grandfather's resting place, and I will tell them that I know where an illegal, undocumented fortune is sitting, a fortune so large that the federal government will seize it, launch a full historical investigation, and shut down the entire Whispering Coves area for decades. Your fishing grounds will be gone, all of them, and your family's dark secret will be splashed across the front page of every paper in Maine." The threat was perfectly calibrated. Brendan O'Malley didn't fear the loss of the treasure. He feared the loss of control and the publicity that would expose his family's criminal past and attract federal interference to the fishing zones he ruthlessly dominated. The federal closure of a large area of coastline would be financially devastating to his massive operation. Brendan stood there, his chest heaving, his face a mottled mix of hatred and dawning fear. He looked from Elara to his imposing trawler, realizing he was trapped. He could destroy her boat, but he could not silence the truth, which was safely hidden in her house, waiting to become a public record. The risk was too great. With a final venomous snarl, he spat on the deck. "You win this round, Vance, but don't think this is over. That secret will sink you." He spun on his heel, ordering his men in a tight, clipped voice, "Cast off. Back out, now." The sea serpent, too, roared to life, pulling away from the dock with a sudden, violent surge, leaving the small wanderer bobbing alone in its wake. The immediate danger was gone. Elara stood her ground until the massive trawler was a distant dot. Her legs shaking from the adrenaline, she returned to the cottage, where Martha was waiting, tears spent, but with a new look of quiet dignity and peace. The 70-year-old threat had been neutralized by Elara's courage and ST's careful planning. The battle was won. The days and weeks that followed were a whirlwind of quiet, calculated action. Elara's immediate priority was ensuring the security of her future and, most importantly, her mother's. First, the bottles. Elara contacted an antiques appraiser specializing in rare spirits through a discreet contact in Boston. The valuation was staggering. Each bottle of the 1925 Scotch was estimated at $35,000 to $50,000 due to its age, provenance, and the unique, century-long cellar conditions. The 20 bottles she brought back were a small fraction of the cash, but represented over $1 million in potential liquid assets. Elara sold 5 of the rarest bottles discreetly, enough to pay off the mortgage on the cottage, pay off all her mother's medical debts, and establish a comfortable, secure fund for Martha. The remaining 15 bottles, a personal reserve and a symbol of their new freedom, were resecured in a bank vault far inland. The burden of debt and survival, which had crushed Elara for years, vanished like the morning fog dot the fate of the rest of the treasure. The hundreds of crates in the Whispering Coves became Elara's final, silent promise to her grandfather. She knew she couldn't commercialize it, the legal and logistical nightmare, and the certainty of attracting Brendan's renewed wrath was too great a risk. Instead, she chose to honor T's final wish. The treasure remained secured by the sea. She never revealed the coordinates to anyone, not even to her mother, who was now content with the newfound peace and the locket. The secret was now hers alone, a powerful, quiet anchor against the possibility of future financial storms. She became the silent protector of her family's legacy. With the finances settled, Elara turned her attention to the docks. She used a portion of the funds to purchase a powerful, modern, but second-hand engine. The engine was not installed in the Salty Dog, which she retired with respect, but in the Wanderer. The old boat, now with a solid hull, a refurbished cabin, and a silent, roaring heart, was rechristened, painted in a defiant, deep blue, and registered legally. The Wanderer was no longer a symbol of desperation, but a statement of strength and independence. The change in Elara Vance was subtle but profound. She continued to fish not out of necessity, but out of choice, out of a deep-seated love for the rhythm of the sea. But now, she fished with an undeniable, quiet confidence. She no longer averted her eyes from Brendan O'Malley. When their boats passed, she offered a direct, level gaze that told him, "You may be the king of the North, but I am the silent mistress of its secrets." Brendan, constrained by the fear of federal investigation and public humiliation, could only respond with a thin, impotent nod of acknowledgement. Martha, free from the shadow of the past, began to thrive. The locket was always near, a tangible connection to the father she had only known as a ghost. The silence between mother and daughter was replaced by a deep, honest understanding, a family line rewritten not by tragedy, but by resilience. The Wanderer, the $100 gamble, became a local legend. No one knew where Elara got the funds for the new engine, but they saw the results. A small, independent fisher thriving against all odds. She proved that courage, tradition, and a bit of luck, or perhaps a family secret, could outweigh greed and corporate power. Elara often sailed the Wanderer, alone towards the north coast, but never entered the coves. She would stop just short of the Twins of Patience, looking out over the churning water where the currents met. She was not looking for treasure. She was looking at the horizon, a woman who had faced her past, secured her future, and in the process had found the unshakable freedom that comes from carrying a powerful personal truth. The sea had taken her father, but it had given her a legacy, a purpose, and a peace more valuable than all the Scotch sealed in the dark, silent cove.